Before you watch another second of this video, I want you to do something for me. Type in the comments right now, this exact second, where in the world you are watching this from, and what time it is for you as you hear my voice. Because somewhere out there, at this exact hour, in your exact time zone, there is a version of this same night that happened nearly 80 years ago, in a quiet corner of Los Angeles, that ended with a young woman's body cut cleanly in half, drained of blood, washed clean, and arranged in an empty field like she was meant to be found. Like someone wanted her to be seen. She was 22 years old. She had a name, a family, a fiancé who never got the chance to marry her. And by the time the sun rose that morning, she had already been given a new name by the newspapers. A name that would outlive her real one. A name that would turn her murder into a national obsession, and her killer into a ghost that has never, not once, been caught. Tonight, wherever you are, whatever time it is where you're sitting, you are going to hear the true story of the Black Dahlia. And somewhere near the end of this video, I am going to tell you exactly who the leading suspect was, the evidence that nearly convicted him, and why, to this very day, he has never faced justice. Stay with me. This one gets stranger the further in you go. Quick thing before we go further into this. If you're new to this channel, this is the Cold Case Archive, and every single week we dig into a real, unsolved American murder, no fiction, no dramatization, just the actual documented facts, told properly. If that sounds like your kind of channel, hit subscribe right now before you forget, because trust me, you are going to want to see how this story ends. Alright. Let's go back to the beginning. It was the 15th of January, 1947. A cool, overcast morning in Los Angeles, California. A woman was walking with her small child along South Norton Avenue, in a quiet, half-developed neighborhood known as Leimert Park. It was the kind of street where nothing ever happened. Vacant lots, unfinished sidewalks, the occasional passing car. As she walked, something in the grass caught her eye. At first, she assumed it was trash. Then she thought, strangely, that it looked like a broken mannequin, discarded in the weeds, pale and oddly positioned. It was not a mannequin. It was the body of a young woman. Naked. Severed cleanly in two at the waist. The two halves of her body had been deliberately separated and posed several inches apart, arms raised above her head in a manner that seemed almost theatrical, as though whoever left her there wanted her to be discovered exactly like this. Police arrived within minutes. What they found would go on to become one of the most studied, most disturbing, and most infamous unsolved crime scenes in American history. The method used to sever her body was later compared by medical examiners to a 1930s surgical technique known as a hemicorporectomy, a procedure requiring precision, patience, and real anatomical knowledge. There was almost no blood found at the scene itself, which told investigators something important right away. She had not been killed here. She had been killed somewhere else entirely, her body drained and cleaned, and then transported to this empty lot and deliberately arranged. Her face had been cut from the corners of her mouth outward, toward each ear, in what's sometimes grimly referred to as a Glasgow smile. Her thighs and chest bore deep lacerations, with portions of flesh removed. There was bruising and rope marks consistent with restraint. And most disturbing of all to the detective standing over her that morning, her body had been washed. Scrubbed clean by her killer before he ever left her there to be found. This was not a crime of blind rage. This was something colder. Something controlled. The coroner would later rule her official cause of death as hemorrhage and shock, caused by repeated blunt force trauma to the head and face. She had nothing on her. No purse. No wallet. No identification of any kind. For a few hours, she was simply an unidentified woman in a vacant lot, and Los Angeles had absolutely no idea what was about to happen next. Detectives moved fast. They took her fingerprints at the scene and wired them directly to the Federal Bureau of Investigation for identification. And remarkably, within hours, they had not one, but two matches on file. The first came from a job application she had submitted years earlier, seeking clerical work at a military base commissary in California. The second came from an arrest record. She had been picked up in Santa Barbara for underage drinking back in 1943. Her name was Elizabeth Short. She was born on the 29th of July, 1924, in the Hyde Park area of Boston, Massachusetts, the third of 5 daughters born to Cleo Short and his wife, Phoebe. Her childhood was shaped early by instability. Her father had built a modest life as a builder of miniature golf courses, but lost the bulk of the family's savings in the stock market crash of 1929. Not long after, his car was discovered abandoned on a bridge, and for years, the family believed he had taken his own life. It would later come out that he hadn't died at all, he had simply chosen to disappear and start a new life elsewhere, without telling any of them the truth. Elizabeth's own health struggled through much of her youth. She suffered from severe asthma and bronchitis as a child, serious enough that she underwent lung surgery at the age of just 15. She spent several winters living with relatives in Florida, chasing warmer air that might ease her symptoms. She never finished high school. At 18 years old, she made the decision to move across the country to California, to reunite with the father who had vanished from her life years earlier. It did not go well. The two clashed constantly, and within a short time, Elizabeth had moved out on her own entirely. What followed were a handful of restless years, new cities, new jobs, new relationships, a pattern of constant movement that would later make her final months almost impossible for investigators to fully reconstruct. She lived for a period with a serviceman, reportedly enduring abuse in that relationship. She was arrested for underage drinking in Santa Barbara, the very arrest that would later identify her body. She met an Air Force officer in Florida, fell in love, and accepted his proposal of marriage by letter as he prepared to deploy overseas during the final stretch of the Second World War. He never came home. His plane crashed in August of 1945, just months before the war's end. Nearly a year later, in the summer of 1946, Elizabeth made her way to Los Angeles to visit an old acquaintance stationed nearby. She stayed. She took work as a waitress, rented a small room behind a nightclub on Hollywood Boulevard, and lived a kind of transient, hopeful, uncertain life that thousands of young women were living in post-war Los Angeles, chasing some version of a future they couldn't quite name yet. She had no idea she had less than 6 months left to live. The last confirmed sighting of Elizabeth alive was on the 9th of January, 1947, 6 days before her body would be discovered. A man she had been seeing, a married salesman, drove her back to Los Angeles after a trip to San Diego and dropped her at a hotel downtown. He later told investigators she said she planned to meet one of her sisters there that same afternoon. Hotel staff would later confirm seeing her in the lobby that day, using the public payphone. She was spotted once more that evening, at a cocktail lounge just a few blocks away. And then, nothing. 6 full days, completely unaccounted for. No confirmed sightings. No witnesses. No trace of where she went, who she was with, or what happened to her, between that final glimpse in a hotel lobby and the morning her body was found in an empty field 2 miles away. To this day, no one has ever definitively answered where Elizabeth Short was, or who she was with, during those final 6 days of her life. Less than a week after her body was discovered, something happened that would transform this from a straightforward murder investigation into one of the strangest media spectacles in American criminal history. An editor at the Los Angeles Examiner received a phone call from an unknown man. The caller congratulated him on the paper's coverage of a case so far. He claimed personal responsibility for the killing. He told the editor he intended to eventually turn himself in, but only after leading police on a longer chase. And before hanging up, he added one final chilling detail: the editor should expect some souvenirs of Elizabeth in the mail very soon. 3 days later, an envelope arrived at the newspaper's offices. The front of it was covered in letters cut from newspaper print, spelling out a message addressed to the paper. Inside were several of Elizabeth's personal belongings, her birth certificate, business cards, photographs, and slips of paper with names written on them. Among them was an address book, with a name embossed clearly across its cover. Every single item inside that envelope had been carefully wiped down with gasoline. The exact same method used to clean Elizabeth's body before it was left in that field. Investigators were now confident, whoever sent this envelope, and whoever killed Elizabeth Short, were one and the same person. Fingerprints were eventually recovered from the envelope, and for a brief moment, investigators believed they might finally have a real, physical lead. That hope collapsed when it was discovered the prints had been compromised while in transit to the laboratory. More letters followed over the coming weeks. Some taunting. Some contradictory. One promised a surrender at a specific time and place, the sender never showed. Another, just days later, claimed the killer had changed his mind entirely, insisting the murder had been, in his own words, justified. In mid-March, a pile of men's clothing was discovered folded on a beach in Venice, a neighborhood in Los Angeles. Tucked inside was a note, styled as a suicide confession, apologizing for the murder and signed simply, "Sorry, Mary." No physical evidence was ever found connecting that note, or those clothes, to Elizabeth's actual killer. Whether it was a genuine confession, or simply one more disturbed individual capitalizing on the most talked-about murder in the country, has never been determined. Throughout it all, the Los Angeles Examiner exploited the case for every ounce of exclusive coverage it could extract. At one especially cold moment, journalists contacted Elizabeth's own mother under the false pretense that her daughter had won a beauty contest, only revealing the truth of her murder after extracting as much emotional reaction from her as they could for print. Over the following weeks, more than 150 men were brought in and questioned by police. One by one, they were cleared. The trail, again and again, went cold. Several names circulated early in the investigation. Robert Manley, the married man who had dropped Elizabeth at the hotel days before her death, was an obvious early suspect simply by virtue of being one of the last people to see her alive. He was eventually cleared, his account of events could largely be corroborated, no physical evidence tied him to the crime, and he passed multiple polygraph examinations, which at the time were considered strong evidence of innocence. Mark Hansen, a wealthy nightclub owner who had known Elizabeth and whose name appeared on that address book recovered from the mailed envelope, was investigated closely. A friend of Elizabeth's told police that she had recently rejected his romantic advances, offering a possible motive. Ultimately, Hansen was ruled out as well. Other names would surface over the following decades, a former mortician's assistant who seemed to know disturbing details about the crime that had never been made public, a man who reportedly had a brief relationship with Elizabeth, and even a woman who, decades later, would claim her own father was responsible, though a search of his property turned up no physical evidence whatsoever. None of them stuck. None of them were ever charged. But there was one name that kept resurfacing, again and again, decade after decade. And the deeper investigators looked into him, the harder he became to dismiss. If you're still watching at this point, drop a comment right now with the words, "I'm still here." Let's see who's truly following this story all the way through, because what I'm about to tell you next is the part most people online completely get wrong about this case. Let's continue. His name was George Hodel. Born in Los Angeles in 1907, Hodel was, by every account that survives him, a genuine genius. He graduated high school at the age of 15. He enrolled at the California Institute of Technology shortly after, though he left under a cloud following an affair with the wife of one of his professors. He went on to earn a medical degree from the University of California, Berkeley, in 1938. That medical background mattered enormously to investigators. From the very first day of the case, detectives had concluded that whoever killed Elizabeth Short likely possessed real surgical knowledge, the kind of anatomical precision seen in an operating theater, not in an act of impulsive violence. Hodel came onto the radar of investigators early in the original 1947 investigation. But the full scope of what he may have been capable of would not become public knowledge for more than half a century. In 1949, Hodel's own 14-year-old daughter came forward and accused him of sexual abuse, alleging that he had also impregnated her. During the highly publicized trial that followed, multiple witnesses testified to having directly seen the abuse take place. One of Hodel's own longtime friends admitted under oath that he too had attempted to abuse the teenager. Despite this, Hodel was ultimately acquitted, while his daughter was sent to a juvenile detention facility, her credibility destroyed by an aggressive legal defense that painted her as an attention-seeking liar, a narrative that, disturbingly, even some of her own family members came to believe. Though he walked free from that trial, the Los Angeles District Attorney's Office remained deeply unsettled by what they had heard in that courtroom. In an extraordinary move, they authorized a wiretap on Hodel's private residence, which ran for several weeks in the early months of 1950. What they recorded has haunted this case ever since. On one of those recordings, Hodel can be heard saying, seemingly to no one in particular, almost as if daring an unseen listener, "Supposing I did kill the Black Dahlia. They couldn't prove it now. In the very same recording, he references his former secretary, a woman who had died 2 years earlier from an overdose of barbiturates, adding, with chilling casualness, "Maybe I did kill my secretary." Now, to be fair to the historical record, that recording alone is not proof. Some researchers who have studied this case believe Hodel suspected, correctly, that his home was under surveillance, and that these statements were a deliberate, calculated taunt aimed directly at the police he knew were listening. That is entirely possible. A wiretapped boast is not a confession, and it was never treated as conclusive evidence in any court. But the story does not end there. In 2018, decades after that recording was made, a woman living in Indianapolis discovered a 3-page letter tucked away among her late grandfather's belongings. The letter had been written in October of 1949, by a man who had served as an informant to the Los Angeles Police Department. In it, he named a man he identified only by the initials GH, describing him as a personal acquaintance and a police detective, and directly accusing him of murdering both Elizabeth Short and a second woman, whose body had been discovered just a few blocks from the same lot where Elizabeth was found. The letter alleged that this man was being actively shielded by high-ranking figures within the police department itself. Hodel's own son, a retired police detective, spent years after his father's death in 1999 investigating him privately. He became convinced that his father was not only responsible for Elizabeth's murder, but potentially connected to as many as 8 killings in total, several of which he controversially believes may be linked to the still unidentified Zodiac killer. He points to strong handwriting similarities between his father and the taunting letters mailed to newspapers during the original investigation. He points to photographs discovered among his father's personal belongings, showing a young woman he believes closely resembles Elizabeth Short. Elizabeth's own surviving family members have publicly and firmly disagreed with this theory. And here is the detail that matters most of all, the one that keeps this case permanently unresolved no matter how compelling any single piece of evidence may seem. George Hodel was never charged with Elizabeth's murder. Never convicted. He left the United States not long after that wiretap recording was made, living the majority of his remaining life overseas, and died without ever facing a courtroom for this specific crime. Officially, under the law, the murder of Elizabeth Short remains completely, entirely unsolved to this day. Even now, nearly 80 years later, this case has not gone completely silent. In recent years, researchers uncovered an account from a police officer who claimed to have seen Elizabeth in the days just before her murder, describing her as visibly frightened, sobbing, and afraid for her life. It's a detail that, if accurate, suggests she may have known, on some level, that she was in real danger in her final days. Other investigators have begun exploring a possible connection between Elizabeth's murder and the unsolved killing of a woman named Layla Welsh in Kansas City, years earlier. Some researchers point to striking similarities in the level of violence and the apparent familiarity the killer seemed to have with both victims, raising the unsettling possibility that Elizabeth may not have been chosen at random at all. None of this rewrites the official record. The case remains open. The killer, whoever he truly was, has never been brought to justice, and at this point, given how much time has passed, it's unlikely anyone ever will be. What often gets lost in a case this famous is how badly Elizabeth herself was treated after her death. Newspapers described her as a woman who prowled the streets of Hollywood. Reporters fabricated claims that she worked as a sex worker, with absolutely no evidence to support it. Some outlets claimed she was pregnant at the time of her murder. The autopsy directly disproved this. Others speculated wildly and invasively about her private relationships, based on nothing more than rumor and innuendo, simply because a young, attractive woman had been murdered, and the public, at the time, seemed to need a reason to believe she had somehow invited it. She wasn't a headline. She wasn't a cautionary tale. She was a young woman who, in a letter to the fiancé she lost to war, once wrote that she wanted to fly too, that she wanted to see the world, to live, to love, and to be loved in return. She never got that chance. And that's where the case of the Black Dahlia stands today. No arrest. No conviction. No final answer, only a name that has haunted Los Angeles for nearly 80 years, and a suspect who, for many researchers, still feels like the closest thing to the truth we may ever get. If this story pulled you in the way it pulled me in, do 3 things for me right now before you go. Hit like on this video, so more people who need to hear this story actually see it. Drop a comment telling me who you believe really did this, George Hodel, or someone we haven't even talked about yet. And if you haven't already, subscribe to the Cold Case Archive, because next week, we're opening a brand new case file, and trust me, you don't want to miss it. This has been the Cold Case Archive. Some mysteries never get solved. They just get remembered.